Hello, I'm Stephen Matchett from Campus Morning Mail, and this is Expert Opinion, where we ask people who know what's going on in research and education, what's going on. Expert Opinion is brought to you by Twig Marketing, Australia's original higher education marketing consultancy. Got a brand issue or a message that isn't getting out? Talk to Tim Winkler, tim@twigmarketingwhatword.com. And thanks to producer Amanda Johnson from Twig, who makes Expert Opinion happen. Last week, the British Academy announced applications deemed fundable for a small research grant scheme will be selected at random over a 3-year trial. It's, according to the Academy's Ken Edmonds, a fairer and more transparent way of allocating limited funds to a consistently strong field of applications. An analysis of previous rounds for the Academy by Adrian Barnett from QUT and Philip Clark from the University of Oxford reports that random allocation would have made no difference to awards by gender, ethnicity, institution and geography. The Academy hopes, and I quote, "the transparency and simplicity of the system will help to improve research culture more generally and ease the burden on applicants and research officers without impacting the quality of applications and assessment." Adrian Barnett, who will, who will analyse outcomes of the trial, is with me today. Thank you for sparing the time, sir.
Thank you, Stephen, for having me.
So is this really about saving time and money? I mean, can there be biases in selection panels that a randomisation scheme like this can solve?
Yes, well, we think so. With lots of people from funding systems all around the world have come up against this same issue, that when you have a highly competitive system with lots of excellent applicants and not enough money, the final decisions between choosing who to fund and who not to fund are on a knife edge. You know, the nicest example I've ever heard is that it's like choosing your favorite shade of blue. That final decision doesn't come down to anything scientific. It comes down to a sort of gut feeling, which, you know, then becomes non-scientific. And then I think the concern is that when you get to those fine margins, other subconscious biases might start to come in. So let's imagine, you know, the funding line falls and there's a young woman on one side of the line and a young man on the other. Some people might be more inclined to fund the young man because he's not going to go off and have a baby. And they might not say that out loud, but that might influence their final decision.
Yeah, it's a challenge. What about a truly outstanding applicant? I mean, application, shouldn't that be funded without throwing them into a lottery pool? And if you created a guaranteed pool of apps that would be funded without competition, what does it solve?
Yeah, so there is an argument for that. And I mean, back in 12 years ago, when we looked at the NHMRC and looked at how decisions were partly random, what we found was there were 60% of applications that were never funded, 10% of applications that were always funded, and then this 30% grey zone in the middle. And that was just by reallocating who was selected to review your grant, because that's where the randomness comes in. You know, different scientists have different opinions on what's good. So there is an argument that there would be that top cream that everybody agrees is worth funding. But then, interestingly, when somebody looked at the NIH data and compared all the grants that were funded and looked at those grants that got the top scores and those that just made it above the funding line, there was almost no association between the score and the impact of the grant. So what that tells us is, again, we already know this, research is inherently unpredictable. Nobody can tell which things are going to flop and which things are going to go gangbusters. And that, in a way, is a wonderful thing. But to pretend that we can line these grants up when the evidence shows that we really can't, I'm okay with everything being a lottery. But sure, if people want to tweak the system and give like a golden ticket, so the peer reviewers could give a golden ticket to say one grant each, I think that would be fine. But then if you're going to do that, let's evaluate it and let's see if your golden ticket choices were actually better than the other ones that were just funded at random.
Could it be, I can't see how, but could it be gamed? Would it change how people write applications?
One of the reasons I like this system is because it's simpler. Gaming comes in. The more complicated a system you have, the more chance there is for gaming. So this system is simpler. It should be less gameable. All you've got to do is put in an application that is deemed, interesting and feasible. They're the two things that you have to focus on. So you would hope that people might change the way they write applications. You would hope that people might actually put forward more interesting, more innovative ideas. And if that happens, then actually science could progress faster, because at the moment there is a bias in funding towards a sort of incremental, safe research. So if we go for a lottery system where you only have to show that this is feasible, scientists might start putting forward their more interesting ideas, and then some of them will be big flops, but some of them could move the field dramatically. And I mean, the Nobel Prize winner Capecchi, who won multiple NIH grants, the one grant he didn't get funded was for the knockout mouse gene, back in the 1980s.
Sorry, you tell me about that.
Well, he won, I think he won two. He put in 3 NIH grants, he won 2. The one he didn't win funding for was the idea of a knockout mouse gene, which back then was considered close to witchcraft, really, I think somebody said. But cheekily, he spent the money from his other grants on that grant. That ended up winning the Nobel Prize. So some of these things do look ludicrous and outlandish now, and then in 10 years' time, they're accepted. But if we're only going to fund these incremental steps, we're going to be much, much slower to find those big risk, big return grants.
But would there not be a risk that the challenge then falls back to the screening, that people will have to play careful to make sure they don't get knocked out in the first stage?
Yes, it does. There is an argument that this is just moving the goalposts, and certainly when we did a survey of so this scheme's been going, I think since 2015 in New Zealand. So the New Zealand Health Research Council have been using this exact same system of partial lottery for some time. So we surveyed applicants and asked them if it changed the amount of time they spent writing the grant, and they actually didn't, which was quite a surprise. You would have thought you would have needed less time. But yeah, and the responses were, well, you still need to get through the peer review. So you still have to write a very solid grant that's going to get through that peer review. But, hopefully over time, as people understand the system more and they get feedback from what gets through and what doesn't, you might find that the amount of time people actually write goes down. Because that is another key issue in this area. We spend, we've calculated it, centuries of our time, of scientific time in Australia, is spent writing grant applications every year. And then with funding rates in the 10, 12%, what they are now, a huge amount of that time has no immediate return.
Yeah. When you you looked for the British Academy, you looked at previous schemes of theirs and obviously the New Zealand ones as well. What did you generally find?
It's very similar. You have where the funding line falls, you have this very flat range of scores. You have this sort of, if you think about it as a running race or a horse race, there's all these horses crossing the line at almost the same time. They're all getting very similar scores. So picking them apart is almost random anyway. And the reviewers from the British Academy, even though these are people who are social sciences, maybe not, what we would consider the hard sciences, they understood these issues perfectly, and they'd been worried about these issues for a long time. Worried about, are we doing the right thing? Spending all this time picking apart these people who are, you simply cannot pick them apart using any numerical system. So I think for the British Academy, they saw a lottery as a logical switch that's also potentially going to be much fairer.
Did it help, how do I put this, unpopular fields, unfashionable fields, selecting at random?
Look, it could do, couldn't it? Yeah, it could do. Well, what you can do is once you've got a lottery, you can actually stratify it any way you want, because you're now in control. You've got a whole bunch of grants that are fundable. You could control it so exactly, if you've got 100 grants, exactly 50 men and exactly 50 women get funded. You are in complete control, and it's still fair. So you could also, we think these minority fields are not getting enough funding. You can titrate that and increase the amount you get. So you actually get, the funder has much more control in this system.
less of an entire lottery if that happens, though.
It does make it less of a lottery, but so long as you're not doing anything too extreme, people are still getting chosen at random.
Yeah.
If you're really worried about an area, I mean, let's say, for example, here in Australia, we know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research is a priority. If you're really worried, then fund almost everything in that area. And yeah, that is protected from the lottery. So, like I say, the funder has a lot more choice in this system. So they are the ones who end up having to make more of the big political decisions rather than being peer review decisions.
The elephant in the room, as it were, is the NHMRC, which is now looking at investigator grants and how they are allocated, particularly in terms of gender split. You could apply the model to that?
I think so. I mean, so far, the New Zealand scheme and the British Academy scheme, they're both relatively small schemes. Well, although the New Zealand scheme is 150,000 New Zealand dollars, so that's not too small, but small in terms of the number of applicants. What I'm kind of hoping for is, if these systems work in the smaller schemes, that they will expand and they might start to be applied to some of these bigger schemes. I mean, I will say we suggested this to Warwick Anderson back in 2015, and he made a joke about us in his speech to the National Press Club, to laugh off this idea. But we've stuck with it because the data repeatedly shows, in lots of systems around the world now, the data repeatedly shows that these decisions are already being made at random. So it is actually much more logical to formalize that randomness.
When you refer to the Institutes of Health, that's the US National Institutes of Health?
The US National Institutes of Health, yes. Yeah. And they, we do know there was also some discussion of a lottery there with the previous administration, with the Trump administration. So I'm not sure if that's continuing now.
What would you say to, if the minister called and said, what should we do about this now? What would you say to him?
I think I would stick back on the science. The science is we cannot pick apart these applicants. We're spending a lot of time and effort picking apart things that are not differentiable. So therefore, a lottery is likely to be cheaper, likely to be fairer, and also, and another interesting thing about the lottery is, and again, we've done surveys of people are happier to be rejected by a lottery than they are by a person. It's less, there's much less animosity in the system if we use a lottery. And I think that's a benefit not to be underestimated. You do meet people in Australia, and I have met people in Australia who believe that the system is against them. I don't think that's true. I think it's just, it is just random. But if we can take some of the heat out of this system, and of course winning funding is massively important, to your whole career. So yeah, I think that's another added benefit.
Yes, I mean, the fact that you're accepted into the pool validates your status, whether or not you get the dough or not.
Yeah, and similarly as well, on the other side, I do think that people who win funding tend to overestimate that as a signal of their greatness, when actually anybody who wins funding, or most people who win funding, should really acknowledge that, look, some of that happens just by chance. Just you got lucky this year with the people who were chosen to review your grant, happen to like it, happen to understand it. In other years, in an alternative universe, you could have easily not have been funded. So I do worry sometimes that we do over-celebrate this system, and in terms of promotion, it gets used. And we're just sort of pushing this randomness down the line, and the people who end up winning are actually often maybe the people who are just lucky, rather than necessarily the people who are really talented.
Yeah, and become self-fulfilling over time.
That's right. Well, one of the things, if a decision is hard to make about who to fund,
go with what's safe.
One of the things you might fall back on is, well, have they won funding in the past? And of course, like you said, well, then that's just self-fulfilling.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but from memory, there are a limit to the number of applications you can put in over time for various schemes.
For the British Academy one and for the New Zealand one, yeah, I think it's just one per person. So yeah, you can't.
But over subsequent years, that if you fail to get X number a grant in 5 rounds of a particular scheme, you can no longer apply. Does that apply anywhere?
That's not my understanding. I know they tried that in the US.
Yeah.
They tried, if you had 3 strikes, they tried to stop it. They tried to stop you applying again as a way to kind of take the heat out of the system and take the numbers out. And that actually got overturned in court. So, you know, it's because we know there's chance in the system, you can have 3 grant failures and still be very good.
Yeah. Well, and this would prevent any thought of that. Because if it's entirely random, not winning doesn't prove anything.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I should say it's not entirely random. You still, like I say, you've still got
to get to that first stage.
Yeah.
Yeah. So who should assess the first stage in an optimum scheme? The standard agency reviewers, the same expert panels?
Yes, that's what they've been using. Yeah. And interestingly, you know, we're going to survey them to see if they change their attitude. You know, it should be easier to just think that question, well, is this viable? Is this interesting? Those 2 questions should be easier than, well, is this worth a 5.5 to a 5.6? That is a very difficult question that you can end up spending a hell of a lot of time and effort on for possibly real benefit.
So will you test the guidelines? I mean, I imagine there will be guidelines for the pre-screen.
Yes.
It'll become quite crucial how they are written very carefully, I'd imagine.
Yes, exactly. Yes. But I mean, if you think about the guidelines of scoring, I mean, some of those I find very difficult to understand. You know, what is the difference between a 5 and a 6 and a 6 and a 7? It's when people try and describe it, it actually becomes very abstract. And also you will see people report that when they're scoring a grant, they're not really thinking about the scores.
Yeah.
The question they're thinking about is, does this person deserve funding or not? And they will adjust their scores to get that outcome.
That becomes very difficult indeed, doesn't it?
Yeah. So what this idea is, well, let's cut out that middleman of scores and just go straight to the decision. And then you hopefully will get better decisions. It's wet here.
I was going to say, you're either transporting into a different dimension, or it's raining.
It's raining.
What will critics say about the British Academy?
Well, surprisingly, the reaction on Twitter that I saw was mostly positive.
Yeah.
And similarly with the Health Research Council, I mean, with the Health Research Council in New Zealand, that was written up. There was a Nature article published on that. So, that was actually good publicity for them. They took a risk. It paid off. Applicants were quite supportive of it. We did a survey of applicants. So I don't really see this as much of a risk, given the strong evidence, as we've said, for multiple systems around the world, that we simply cannot pick apart grants based on scoring. So it's really long before time that we tried something else.
Yeah. Why has it taken? I can remember this being discussed 20 years ago.
Yes.
And it just takes that long to move through the system.
Look, I think when it comes to handing out money,
when
it comes to handing out funding, people do become a bit conservative. It does feel, I think some reviewers almost take it personally. Well, this money, I've got to really make sure this money goes to the right place. And people become naturally conservative. And you do still find, and I think they're in the minority, but you do still see those attitudes of people who say, no, you can do this. You can rank. If you give me 50 grants, I can rank them from 1 to 50 without ties. And some people genuinely believe that, but that flies in the face of the evidence.
You can hear questions in the House of Reps about this.
Sure. And look, I remember, going back to Warwick Anderson, the word random was considered a very bad word to say, that didn't look great. I think the way to flip that is to say, we are blessed with all these very talented applicants that we cannot tell apart. That's the reason we need a lottery. There's simply no way of telling them apart.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent way to end this on. Look, thank you for your time. I know you're busy, particularly today. It's been very kind of you to spare the time. I hope you come back and tell us more about your research as it goes on.
Thanks, Stephen. Always happy to talk about this.
This is Stephen Matchett from Expert Opinion, and we're out. Thank you.